This episode is sponsored by the Real Estate Foundation of BC. REF BC is a philanthropic organization that supports sustainable, equitable, and socially just relationships with land and water. Learn more about the Foundation's grants and initiatives at refbc.com.
Yedek Shwanwan Shnukwa Injod Shashneya Ash Darwin Hanna and Shwash Slu Nikai Ken Intlikamaken. Good morning, Aaron, my friend. My name is Shashneya. That's my Intlikamachin name. My English name is Darwin Hanna. I'm from Nikaya, which is on the west side of Lytton, and I'm a member of the Intlikamac Nation.
Can you tell us what that means, what it means to be from your community, your experiences growing up?
Yes. So being a member of the Intlikamac, we're proud people. Our people, have a large family, and it's a very seasonal way of life for family and community and our nation. Fishery is one of the mainstays, but there's also a lot of daily use of the plants and different herbs and so on, and there's a lot of gatherings and a lot of things, a lot of learning, and things are very active in the community, but it's always a lifelong learning. So for me, like learning about our language, it's a ongoing initiative, and learning about the culture is always ongoing. So although I'm getting on in age, it's still ongoing learning, and so yes, it's just.
Did you grow up on reserve?
No, I didn't grow up in the community. So the place where my family's from is called Nikaya. So every place has a different name in our territory, and so when my grandparents talked about the different places, they actually never refer to like a reserve. It's always like a place name. So in our nation we have many place names that are Intlikamac. And so I grew up in Maple Ridge, which is in the suburbs, and so my grandparents moved down to Langley after they retired, and so I spent a lot of time with my grandparents over the when they were alive, and I learned a lot about the community, and I had the opportunity to, over the years, you attend a lot of funerals and weddings and different community events. And then during my undergrad, I had the opportunity to do a co-op program with my tribal council as in my undergrad, and also did some other work in the community. And probably half my work right now is in the community. So I do a lot of travel back and forth, and yeah, so just one of those things, so although I live in Vancouver right now with my wife, so we're always traveling lots for work and for family and different events. You
wrote a book about your community, if I'm not mistaken. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, the book is called Our Tellings, and that was published back in the year 1995 by UBC Press, and this is a project I worked on during my undergrad, and when I was also living in the community, and so it's a collection of stories. I worked with elder. Her name is Mimi Henry, and she was a language specialist, and so we interviewed different elders in the language and had the stories translated. Some of the stories were in English. And so the book was based upon certain creation stories of Shinkiap, coyote, and other animals during the pre-creation time period, which is known as Shprak, time before humans. But with these creation stories of coyote, is about his doings and different bad deeds and so on, and about how our nation was created. And then we also have different historic stories of the first encounter of Simon Fraser, stories about the setting aside of the reserves, and the conflict of the gold rush, the meeting between our head chief, Shishpintlim, and James Douglas, and the conflict back at that time, and more of things that happened more historically, and also including, the impacts of the residential school in Lytton called, her name, St. George's, and really about our way of life. So the book was provided to the band schools, and it was just republished. I know that the book is still utilized by the Stein Valley Academic School in Lytton, and took us around 4 years to have it republished by UBC Press. And so we will be providing more books to the band schools shortly.
What was that like? Was it meaningful to be able to start to understand the roots of your community, what they kind of endured? Was it challenging to hear about probably individuals like Joseph Trutch, bad actors in history? What was the experience to kind of gather that information and develop a deep understanding of it?
Right. I think it's learning about the impacts of colonization, because we are one nation, one territory. And through different colonial acts, from the first encounters of non-Native people today, we still have ongoing colonization, in that we have a deep connection to our land, our territory, and yet to this day, the Crown still does not recognize our Aboriginal title, does not recognize our rights fully, and so just looking at how the Indian Act has caused conflict for our nation, and so we have to move away from the Indian Act eventually. It just takes time. We're still going through a healing process, because St. George's was a very nasty residential school. On the way up, I was reflecting upon going into the old barn that was utilized for the school, and in the attic, there's a writing on the wall from my uncle, and said, the school is just like jail. So he had written that while as a student at the school. And so in studying, criminology in my undergrad, and having the occasion to visit different jails and institutions, the residential school is no different than a jail for many of our community members who had to attend. And so so it's just, dealing with that legacy, and really it's about, power and control, whereby the Crown has a lot of power, a lot of control, and just looking at, like Trans Mountain, when it was built in the 1950s through our traditional territory, that was built without our input, without our consent, and without our benefit. And now they're, doubling the pipeline. And so although there are some agreements, the Crown has not addressed the issue of the impact of that historic pipeline through our territory. And so when that pipeline was built in the 1950s, we had Indian agents in our community. Our members were forced to attend residential school against their will. And I know that for my grandmother, she lived in a remote area, and actually had the RCMP attend my great-grandfather's house to make sure that she attended school. And so you have the use of the police to ensure that our members attended school. And so we're dealing with all this colonial legacy. So that's one of the things about learning, is that you learn through family history and through community history about the ongoing impacts of colonization.
How do you think about it? Do you think of Indigenous communities as incredibly resilient, as strong, as capable of overcoming great adversity? Does this frustrate you with National Truth and Reconciliation Day coming up? How do you think we best think about that day?
Yeah, I think with with our families and communities and nations, we are survivors. We are resilient in that we continue on and we press forward. We're going to have a better tomorrow for our children and for the next generation. And so we try to address these historic wrongs that they're still there to this day. And so when I look at our elders, our great grandparents, they fought to have these issues resolved, and they're still fighting to this day to advocate for the recognition of our title, advocate for the recognition of our rights, to deal with the ability for our people to control education, to be involved in the management of the land, to be involved in all governance. And so, with respect to Orange Shirt Day, is that it's about reflecting upon the history, honoring our way of life, honoring our elders, honoring our people, and also planning for a better tomorrow. So it's about sharing our way of life, sharing our knowledge, but at the same time advocating for a better tomorrow through inclusion and having better arrangements with the Crown.
So at the last event, at the last National Truth and Reconciliation Day, Justin Trudeau went to Tofino. I think he was surfing, spending time with his family. Should we take something from that? Are we strawmanning him based on one day? How do we think about what he was doing that day? How do we think about what Canadians should be doing on that day?
Right. I think it's every Canadian has a role to listen, to learn, and to participate in any community event. And so I know that with any leader, they're always busy and sometimes need time for rest. But nonetheless, Orange Shirt Day is an important day for Canada, and it is a day to reflect upon the past, to learn from the past, to build a better tomorrow, and so it's really it's not a day to really take the day off and relax. It's about to have active learning and active understanding to plan for a better inclusive tomorrow.
Right. I wonder if he would say something like, well, we're doing work on the other 364 days a year. We're making a lot of progress. We're trying to sign agreements with communities. Is that true? I just imagine him saying something along those lines in response.
Right. So his government has made good progress on many of the different files, but still there's more progress to be made. So every day is a day to address the outstanding issues, and there are many, many outstanding issues. And so it's, for me, it's, I'm not involved politically, but, every person has a role to, take steps to advance the outstanding issues to achieve reconciliation. And so, because he's the national leader, it provides a mixed message if he's taking a day off and not honoring and reflecting upon the past and trying to provide a positive message to provide for a better tomorrow.
Yeah, I like that analysis. When did you become interested in law? You did criminology as your undergrad, and then you go on to law. We have similar educational backgrounds, and I found for me, the development of my criminology degree really taught me how to disagree with people in a healthy way, how to have tough conversations about human trafficking, the incarceration rates of Indigenous people, tough kind of issues that maybe we want to not think about. Maybe we want to think about what we're doing that weekend. So having these issues, challenges brought to the forefront meant a lot to me. And then to go on to law school, to see the world through a new lens. What was that sort of journey like for you? When did you decide law school was something you wanted to do?
Right. I think that the choice to go to law school was sort of happened over a course of years, and that growing up was always a bit of the underdog, and then just trying to have fairness, always trying to achieve fairness, and always trying to advocate for a better tomorrow. And so, and learning about my grandparents, and learning from about our title and about how that was not addressed, and learning about about impacts of development on our lands. My uncle had was involved in a court case for the Callison Hanna Band. I have a lot of relatives up there. And so he was working on this court case when I was a teenager, learning about that, how they were successful in obtaining an injunction against the spray of herbicides on the forest, and also taking Canada to court regarding the below fair market value of gravel extraction from their community. So I learned from my uncle regarding how the courts can be used as a tool to advance our community interests. In high school, I took a class called Law 12, and in my I didn't do too well in high school because I worked quite a bit, wasn't fully focused. But going into college, I attended Douglas College for 2 years, and I did quite well, and then went on to SFU for my criminology. And so criminology was a good stepping stone into law, and I knew that if I got good grades, I can get into law school. And I applied, got in my and they used to have different bulletins back then. So my cousin Stephen Point was the former director of the First Nations law program at UBC, and so I applied, got in, and and I think it's from also working my tribal council as part of my undergrad. I learned a lot about the pursuit of Aboriginal rights. When I said pursuit, regarding trying to have Aboriginal rights until recognized, and so attend different political meetings back then, and just to be able to observe and witness of the leaders debating how to move forward with rights and title. And also that time period, you had the Sparrow decision regarding fisheries, regarding the recognition of our people's right to fish for food, social and ceremonial purposes back in, I believe, 1990. And so that was quite influential, myself personally, and also in our community. And also the Stein Valley is part of our nation, and so it's on the west side of Lytton, and so I learned a lot about the Stein Valley and about trying to have the Stein Valley protected from logging. And I was involved in the Stein Valley before law school, as had the opportunity to hike from Lowett Lake over to Lytton to Stein, part of the Stein Rediscovery Program, and was also a guide in there for 2 summers. And so being involved in the Stein Valley really was a good learning experience. And then during articling, I was able to actually work on the agreement that set aside the Stein Valley as a park based upon an agreement between my First Nation, the Lytton First Nation, and the provincial government. Wow. So I had a role in that, and so is this very insightful regarding the action required to take to have lands protected, to really ensure that we have areas that are usable by our people, to honor our way of life, and to ensure that we have this area to use for training for our youth.
That's incredible. What was the law school experience like? Was it what you expected? Was it what you had hoped you would get out of it? For me personally, there was a few courses, yours, First Nations Economic Development, but also taxation and business law, that stood out to me as like, these are the things that I don't hear about in my community. These are the topics I want to take back to my community and return tax law back to my community, because there's tools, there's knowledge in it that can be beneficial. So what was that experience like for you?
Yes, I'm reflecting upon my law school. So in first year, we were put into sections, and in our section we had a total of 4 Indigenous students in my section, myself, my wife Cynthia, Ardith, and Shannon. And so we had our own study group. And so we were quite close to share our briefs, to work together. We had our own study group. And so you had to take all these classes. They're all required classes, all black letter law classes. Aboriginal law wasn't really taught in first year. In fact, in property law, the professor asked us to present on our Aboriginal title perspective, because it simply wasn't offered in law school back then. And all the professors back then were mostly non-native men. And we didn't have a lot of role models, although there was, a key role model was the late Judge Alfred Scow, and also Rennie Taylor. Both of them are from Allard Bay. And so they're very good role models. Also a lawyer by the name of Michael McDonald and some others. And during law school, there was some racism. And so in our year, we had, I think, 20 students thereabouts that were in first year that were Indigenous. And so it was a really transformative time that you have more Indigenous students attending. And really, there's a lot of, Aboriginal rights are coming more to the forefront, but we didn't really have any curriculum based upon Aboriginal rights and title. And so we had to do a lot of, self-learning and promotion of Aboriginal rights and title for inclusion in law school. We had our first Aboriginal Law Days back then. And in third year, we took, they had the first Indigenous Law Clinic. We were the first students in that. So we were able to have one semester working on the downtown east side and representing clients who were required assistance. And so that was a very good experience. And so, there was some, challenges of law school, got through it. And so a lot of the principles I learned from law school, I still utilize to this day. But we sort of use the best of both worlds in our practice. Use the mainstream law, but we also use law that's infused by our own cultural values, our own traditions, and so on.
Right. What you mentioned that there was racism. How did that sort of manifest itself? Because my experience, I don't think we had any of that. People felt there's like a cultural shift. People are eager to understand the wrongs of the past and make amends and be a part of the solution. And it sounds like not everybody in your cohort had that same philosophy.
Right. At that time, I think that there was the live issue there was you had a lot of the non-native students who thought that we were taking seats from their friends. And so they thought it was improper that there was Indigenous law students who were taking their seats. And so at that time, and to this day, Indigenous people are still deeply underrepresented in the legal profession. And so the law school took active steps to provide more seats for Indigenous students. And the vast majority of students have been successful, graduated and so on. And there are some difficulties. And so I think that there was a bit of a, so you have some overt racism in the student publications, comments during law school in class, some very, nasty discussions by students, in class. So you have, racism that's, quite apparent from comments and debate and discussion, even during the moots with some of the lawyers that would attend it. Some of our classmates faced racist comments by the moot supervisor. So there's a lot of overt and subtle racism, and I'd say that racism still is prevalent in law to this day. And that when we look to the legal profession, you look at the composition, there's still a we don't have the full representation or full inclusion of Indigenous lawyers in the profession to this day.
Do you think that that is racism, or just it's going to take time to bring about that kind of change? Because I'm the first from my community to attend law school, but it's not because anybody is standing in my community's way. It's that a lot of people stop after 2 years, 3 years of their undergrad. They don't want to continue education. At least that's from my community.
Right. I think that when you look at it based upon systemic racism, that has been institutionalized over the years, over the decades, because the Indian Act did not enable First Nations to attend law school unless you gave up your Indian status. And so we look at the first law graduates that were Indigenous, did they actually have to give up their Indian status, their identity? And so you have so right now there's no excuse for not having sufficient Indigenous lawyers in the legal profession to this day. So it's a lingering systemic racism that still confronts us to this day.
How do we address it? Are you saying that maybe we should move it from, I think it's still around 20 seats for Indigenous people, we should move that up to like 100 and just open the floodgates and make sure that anybody in an Indigenous community can attend it and get a degree?
I think it's about providing better education opportunities for children, youth, to provide that capacity, to provide that support, so that we have good candidates for law school to have them when they apply, have them accept it. And so there's still a lot of very great candidates, and a lot of younger Indigenous students have choices now. They can go to law school, medical school, go into teaching, and so on. So a lot of choices, but nonetheless, there's still a lack of inclusion of Indigenous people in the law school and overall in the legal profession.
Okay, fair enough. So what made you interested in First Nations economic development? When did that become was that in law school that became an interest? At what point in time did Aboriginal law stand out to you?
Yes, so it started in law school, learning from different classes, corporations and secure transactions, property law, and you learn about, and also through the articling process, you have to take a professional legal training course. You learn about commercial transactions, and so I learned through articling and through my early years and as a young lawyer that many of our clients are involved in business. And so we see that they've developed their business over time. And so they most of our clients required corporations, because they're getting involved in forestry, stores, gas stations, operating campgrounds, having leases, negotiating with industry. And the communities need to have a corporate vehicle to show them from liability, because if you have some of our clients are involved in like forestry is you can have big liability issues that may arise, and so you're trying to limit the liability of the overall nation. So you want to shield the assets from liability from different things that may incur potential liability. So you need to look at a corporate model to deal with taxation, provide for tax exemption, and also to limit liability, but also provide the ability for the nation to participate in business.
Right. That is so interesting. When did you start your law firm? Because you started Callison and Hanna. How did that come about? Because I think I read that your partner you met in first year law school, I think in the early stages as well. So I'm just curious as to when did you decide you wanted to branch out on your own, and how did working with your partner come about?
So after finishing articling, there was at that point, the market was very, very tight. There was actually limited opportunity to become an associate lawyer at that point. And so we decided to, so during articling, I started doing some work for some of the First Nations in my area. And so I knew that if I became had my own law firm, that I'd be able to continue on that relationship. And so that relationship has actually continued on to this day for that one client. And so it's all about connections and relationships. And so we look at how we developed our practice. It's based upon personal relationships. We didn't have a website back then, and but we decided. So we got married on August 31st, 1996. Up at Paselco Lake, and so we after we got married, we decided to open up our own law practice, and so we formed our partnership on October 1st, 1996, and so we slowly expanded. Most of our work is for First Nations and Métis communities, and right now we have 5 associate lawyers. We have moved our office downtown. And so we've just evolved over time. So we have a lot of files that we are negotiating on, dealing with business inclusion, economic inclusion, and dealing with historic legacies. I do a lot of work in specific claims. We have negotiations with mining companies, with the Crown. One client that's involved in a land claim negotiation. And so things have really evolved over the time frame, because at that point it was really more, I would say, old school. But you would provide formal legal opinions and paper everything. Nowadays everything's by email, and everything's a bit different. So and we have very good associates who provide support. And 4 of the 5 of the associates are Indigenous, and so we're quite proud to have articled numerous Indigenous students over the years. And so we just found that many of our clients are involved in business endeavors because of their traditional territory, based upon the recognition of their rights. And they want to benefit from development in their backyard. And so typically what happens is you have a company that wants to develop a mine, or they want to develop forestry, and they have to deal with the First Nations or Métis. And so we're involved in the negotiations and the resulting agreements. And so it's created a lot of work for us over the years.
So one of my big fears when people are learning about Indigenous people, our communities, is it seems like we spoon feed them the worst facts about them. Our overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, low education rates, high birth rates. It feels like when I talk to average people, those are the things they take away. Like, I don't want to go onto reserve, I don't want to trespass, and I don't want to get attacked. Like, there's still those stigmas that exist today. When working as a Native court worker, part of me thought that I was going to be able to fix the problem with the overrepresentation. Mm-hmm. Then you start to realize that a lot of these things are long-lasting, that they're very difficult to, if you help someone get counseling, that will help for 6 months, a year, then they may find their way back into it. And the executive director of the Native Court Workers has this great line where it's like, our goal isn't to stop someone from ever visiting court again or having court matters, because that's an unrealistic expectation of them. The goal is to make the space between their interactions larger and larger. So first it's 3 months, then it's 6 months, then it's a year, and then it's 2 years, then it's 5 years. Then one day they're not coming back. And so the goals are much more realistic within it. But taking your course, learning about business, learning about economic development, it really sounds like a lot of the long-term solutions for Indigenous communities can be found in developing in a way that works best for them, because then you can address the education rates. You can give the supports necessary for counseling. If you have the money, you can invest in your community in the areas that they need it most. Is that what you learned? Is that kind of your experience of like seeing how they come together?
Yeah, so over the years, things have really transformed between the nations and the Crown, and that now there's a lot more opportunity, a lot more economic opportunity, more inclusion. When we first started out, the communities were quite isolated from the Crown in that there was no sharing of royalties, there was no sharing of forestry opportunities, there was no sharing of the development of land. And it slowly changed over time with different cases and so on. And so now we have communities that we work for that have full employment. And so it's really been remarkable over time where before they were having small operations, and now they have multi-million dollar operations. And so it's really transformed when they have agreements of mining companies that provide benefit payments of millions of dollars per year. And a lot of the nations have these funds placed into trust and have these funds managed for the betterment of their community, providing other opportunities, developing more business, and creating lots of opportunity, and just providing more infrastructure. And so you see it over time, and things have changed. I won't say wholesale, but you have a evolution from the days of the Indian agent. So in Wet'suwet'en, I think the last Indian agent in the community was in 1975, and so and then you have the transformation of the offices of the First Nation offices to be providing more opportunity, and through the resulting agreements, you have empowerment through more opportunity, more resources, and so things have really changed over time. Although there are a lot of issues arising regarding ongoing social economic gaps for communities, you see the closing of that gap through changes in policy, through implementation of case law. Now we have UNDRIP with the ability of First Nations and Métis and Inuit to leverage their the principles of UNDRIP, having companies and the Crown honor the principle of FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent for any project. And so having that FPIC standard honored, it really allows and also enables the nations to leverage this principle through negotiations to get a better result. So it's no longer, trinkets, it's real sharing of the wealth now. But we've got still a long ways to go now. So when we look at Trans Mountain, although they're having some good jobs, some good contracts, good benefits, the fact is that Canada, being the owner of Trans Mountain, has not provided redress for the historic and ongoing, I'd say, trespass of the pipeline through our nation's territories. So although they're dealing with the pipeline under construction, they've not dealt with that historic legacy. So we're seeing now with some companies dealing with that historic legacy, and we have negotiated certain redress agreements with certain companies to deal with historic compensation, to deal with historic wrongs. So we still have a long ways to go, but things are definitely transforming through different agreements, different rulings, and through prudent management.
Before we go too far, I want to differentiate between Aboriginal law and Indigenous law for people who might not realize. From my understanding, Indigenous law centers around the laws that we would have had pre-colonization, the oral history, the stories around how to live a good life, the responsibilities you have to the land, the ideas that have percolated over a very, very long time. Aboriginal law centers around the relationship between the Crown, the British, the French, and Indigenous people. And that has developed over time, originally with like the Calder decision, and then has changed as a consequence of Section 35, and kind of evolved from there. Can you help us understand the two areas?
Right. So reflect upon the reference to laws that relates to our community. So in a formal sense, I've seen it evolve over the years, going from Indian law to Native law to First Nation law to Indigenous law. But in our legal practice, we deal with Indigenous law, First Nation law. There's when we look at Indigenous law, it's based upon our language, based upon our culture, it's based upon our way of life. We don't have like a code. I know there's been some initiatives to codify our laws. I'm not really in favor of codifying our laws because our laws are based upon our way of life, our community, our nation. It's about our relations with one another. And so it's really hard to, it's a lived experience. And so it's really hard to have a law saying, this is the law for our nation. It's about the way of life on a daily basis. Whereas Aboriginal law deals with the intersection between the Crown, Section 35 of the Constitution Act, and the way of life of our people. So it's intermixed. And so in our practice, we use a bit of both. And so in our specific claim hearings, we're able to bring in oral history evidence, have evidence brought forward in the language through translation and so on. And so the judge is able to make a ruling based upon the historic record, which is really the archival record, plus the oral history evidence, which is infused with our legal principles.
That is fascinating. So your mainstay is Aboriginal law in that you help Indigenous communities negotiate. Do you feel like one of the big fears is that Indigenous people are being forced to choose between the environment and getting out of poverty? How do you kind of see those issues? Because there's arguments, no pipeline, because it's bad for the environment long term, and Indigenous people care deeply about the environment. And then the other side is it's not fair to ask them to stay in this economic position long term for the environment because they're experiencing detrimental impacts by staying in poverty.
Right. So for community nations, it comes down to the right of self-determination regarding how do they want to manage their lands. When I say manage, it's regarding make decisions regarding their lands. The problem, though, is that the Crown has a process for third-party developers to develop Crown lands, which are really our lands. And so you have the ongoing conflict. And so to this day in the province of BC, we don't have the recognition of our original title. So even though we may self-determine to set aside watersheds, set aside areas for more sustainable development, you have the pressure of the Crown fostering industrial development. And so it's up to the community, but sometimes it's hard for the community to oppose a project because the Crown wants the pipeline to be built. So it's very tough. But on single projects, maybe a forestry development, it's really up to the community to inform that. They can say yes, no, or let's have more of a process. And so it's really about obtaining the will of the people. What do the membership say? and to find balance between, having sustainable jobs and, long-term jobs or short-term jobs. And so it's really up to the community to really decide. So acting as legal counsel for communities, we have to really honor the direction of the community. And so some will want to be involved, but some may say, no, we don't want to be involved. But you got to respect that.
Interesting. So when I wrote my directed research paper on First Nations economic development, I kind of understood that there's like a rubric. The first step is to consult the community, sit down with the members. In my community's case, we have around 650, try and connect with them, understand where are the problems, what do you think the solutions are, where do you want the community to be in 10, 20, 50 years, what would progress look like to you, and how do we improve the circumstances of your life? And then with all of that information, you develop a comprehensive community plan, an economic development plan, similar to what municipalities often have, which is kind of like an official community plan. And then you give that back to the members to give feedback on what did we miss, what did we forget, what did we underestimate, and then you start to try and implement those plans. Is that generally a good kind of best practice?
Yes, with respect to the planning process, so the comprehensive community planning process you're talking about is mostly for a First Nation on the reserve. Doesn't fully address the traditional territory fully, and so what happens here is that you might have good plans for the traditional territory, but then you have a developer coming in and wants to develop a mine. Then you have a competing interest. And then you have the Crown who wants to support that mine or that pipeline. And so you have these competing interests. And that's the problem, is that you have these legacy projects in the territories. You have these legacy pipelines, mines, forestry. You have the impacts of these linear projects, highways, hydro transmission lines. You get natural gas pipelines and so on. So you have all these ongoing colonial legacies through the territory, and then pressing pressure from developers. So although the community may have a plan, how do you reconcile that plan with a broader initiative of industry and the Crown? And that's the thing right now. So right now we don't have the full respect for coal management in BC on the traditional territory. I just call it lip service. So, but on the reserve, planning is great. It's needed. But how do you provide that planning process to the whole traditional territory, and how have industry and the Crown honor and respect that broader nation plan for the traditional territory?
Right. That seems like it would be a particular challenge, because the power of money to influence people's decisions, the long-term economic benefits to the government, to that business. How is there a best practice in regards to trying to square that issue? Is there a leaning towards industry in that regard? Is there a leaning to First Nations communities right now in that regard? What do you sort of see?
Right. Okay. So basically the colonial framework to this day favors development by developers. Fostered by the Crown, by the province, by Canada. And so, if UNDRIP being implemented, which is a game changer, we'll see what happens over the ensuing years. But since BC has agreed to adopt UNDRIP through their DRIP legislation, things have not changed on the ground. So we're at least 2 years into the DRIP legislation, and you still have the Crown making major decisions over land development. So it has to switch to that, or have a more of a level playing field, and that there needs to be inclusion of the First Nations developing land in BC, being co-managers or managers of the land base within their traditional territory. And so we need to have the Crown change their policy, change laws to respect the planning process of the nations. And the planning process requires meeting to ascertain the will of the people, will of the membership.
Interesting. So the big fear around free, prior, and informed consent is that it's going to shut down business and that BC is going to close for business if we were to do something like that. And I've heard that echoed in news questions and stuff. What is the response to that? How do we understand this in a healthier way than just this is just going to shut down all the business?
Right. Okay. Really, the FPIC standard has been implemented for quite a few years in BC, probably in the last 10 to 20 years, the having a nation providing their free, prior, and informed consent. So no project goes ahead today without involvement, inclusion of affected Indigenous groups. And that's been happening for many, many years now. And so the sky's not falling in. You can have resulting agreements. And so there's agreements on everything that happens nowadays. On the recovery, you look at the atmospheric river event, the what's happened with the Coquihalla Highway and the Highway 8 and other roads, that you have companies partnering and joint venturing with affected Indigenous communities that provides a win-win for both the company, but also for the community. They get preferential opportunity for jobs, contracts, some sharing of the business profits, being involved in management decisions. So FPIC is here to stay, and it's evolved over time, and it does provide greater inclusion of the affected Indigenous communities for a better community, better nation, basically.
So which one do you think is going to have a long-term larger effect? Section 35? Or FPIC coming about and giving more power to the First Nations voices? So really, the UNDRIP and FPIC and Section 35 have really intersected over time. Because when you look at Section 35, based upon the Chilcotin decision, where the Crown must respect and acknowledge Aboriginal title and implement Aboriginal title, Aboriginal title involves having the Crown and industry respect the consent of the nation, and so consent is part of the FPIC standard, and so the problem right now is that we still have the Crown denying the existence of Aboriginal title in BC, and so to achieve full reconciliation, we need to have the Crown acknowledge and recognize and implement Aboriginal title, and that will provide the ability for nations to properly provide their consent for any development happening within their territory. Interesting. When you say the Crown, who are we talking about? Because the Crown has often been described at various levels of government, and you're saying particularly in BC, and I think at one point in time it was involved with actual Crown Counsel who also prosecute criminal files and stuff. So when we're talking about the Crown, who are we talking about? Yeah,
so the Crown I'm referring to is both the provincial Crown and the federal Crown. So the provincial Crown is the provincial government. The federal Crown is the federal government. So in BC, you have the provincial government having administrative control over Crown lands, and you have the federal government having administrative lawmaking authority over certain federal matters, including fisheries, major projects, pipelines, and so you have them intersecting in certain projects, and so you intersect to, and even with the Indian Act, you have reserve lands held by Her Majesty for use and benefit of a First Nation, and so Her Majesty is the Crown. And so we really need to devolve certain power over to affected Indigenous groups over time and through negotiations. And so the problem right now is that the province makes claim to Crown land, and we have Aboriginal title. And how do we reconcile these two differences? We don't have the premier going to First Nations saying, look, we recognize your title and we want you to have the ability to manage your title lands. We don't have the province coming to our people saying that, yes, let's implement your title, they say that you have to negotiate it through a land claim process. But the land claim process involves the release of original title in the name of certainty. And so there's an ongoing conflict between the viewpoint of how to recognize title in BC. And so it's going to take time, but we do. Our communities are getting impatient, I guess. So
yeah, and this seems like it gets even more complicated when we talk about getting out from under the Indian Act. The challenge, it seems like, is different communities are trying to figure out the best way forward for them, and it seems to go in such different directions. And I'm wondering if you can help us understand it, because I believe it's the Nisga'a that chose a treaty, which is different than what other communities more recently are choosing, like, I believe, Wet'suwet'en. Can you help us understand the different paths that communities are taking in regards to moving out from underneath the Indian Act?
Right. So the Indian Act was imposed upon First Nations in BC really during the reserve creation process in the 1870s, 1880s in BC, and then became more imposed in the 1950s. It was really imposed through the requirement for elected chief and councils in the 1950s. And so we still have the Indian Act to this day. So we need to move into decolonization to devolve those reserve lands to those First Nations if they so choose. So really a First Nation should say, or could say, we want to be the full manager and owner of our reserve lands. And so there should be the ability to enter into a self-government agreement with Canada to have those lands transferred over to the control of the First Nation. So historically, Canada has achieved that through modern land claim agreements, first involving the Nisga'a and later on involving the Wet'suwet'en. And so those agreements resulted in the transfer of their reserve lands into lands owned by those First Nations and now fee simple. And so and now Canada has a process to have a more of a nuanced approach through land code, whereby if you adopt a land code as a First Nation, you can control your reserve lands. You don't need to go to Canada to have a lease approved. So right now, most reserve lands are underdeveloped because to develop them properly, you need to have Canada provide their consent to any leases. So it takes on average around 6 years to have reserve lands leased for commercial development.
Wow.
Which is a very long time. And so, but Canada is not allowing all First Nations at once to have a land code. They have what's called a rolling 30. So only 30 First Nations across Canada can negotiate a land code. So it's a very, very slow process to have a land code adopted. And my thinking is that the Indian Affairs should shut down their Indian Affairs office on Melville Street, devolve First Nations to devolve the Reserve Land Administration and the Indian Act file to First Nations if they so choose. So we need to get into the phase of devolution to devolve that colonial power to self-governing nations.
Interesting. So what do you think that would change, and how fast do you think that would make big waves in change?
It could happen over the next 5 years quite easily, next 10 years. The end result is that First Nations will have the ability to administer their own reserve lands without having Canada oversee any administration of their reserve lands. And because Canada right now has a fiduciary duty to ensure that any development is in the best interests of the First Nation. So Canada has a bit of paranoia, I say, about their fiduciary duty. So they're very careful and cautious, which results in huge delays in the development of reserve lands. So you have really, I'd say, wealth that's possible, but it's locked in because of the whole colonial process to develop reserve lands.
Do you think that's in part due to the Musqueam decision?
The Musqueam decision, which is I think you're referring to as the Glass decision?
The golf course.
The golf course. Oh, yeah, the Shaughnessy, that's the Guerin decision. So Guerin involved Canada negotiating a long-term lease to a third-party golf course for the leasing of the Musqueam reserve lands. And so Canada did not disclose the deal to the First Nation, to Musqueam. And so they were found to be in breach of their fiduciary duty to the beneficiary Musqueam First Nation, because the Musqueam were vulnerable to the discretion of Canada. And so Canada is very alive to their fiduciary duty arising from the Guerin decision regarding the management of reserve lands. So they take a very careful approach regarding any decision to lease any reserve lands nowadays.
In the North right now, we have these experiences where First Nations are standing up for their land rights, similar to what happened a long time ago in Ontario, I think in Manitoba. Can you help us understand those issues? There were a lot of protests going on, a lot of strife and fighting. And so I'm just, as an outsider, it seems like the relationship between hereditary chiefs and elected officials seemed to have been kind of the catalyst for a national discussion around truth and reconciliation.
Right. So that emanate from the court case initiated by the Akisq and Wet'suwet'en nations back in the 1980s. And they were seeking a declaration of Aboriginal title over their lands. And they went to trial before former Justice McEachran, and he disregarded their oral history evidence, saying it's not good evidence. And that case was appealed up to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the court found that Justice McEachran should not have ignored or disregarded the oral history evidence of the Akisq and Wet'suwet'en, and ordered a new trial and set out the test to prove Aboriginal title. And the test included the requirement for a judge to consider oral history evidence as having a equal footing as other historic evidence. And so although a new trial was ordered, the trial never proceeded. And then you have more case law over time that confirmed the existence of Aboriginal title, namely the Haida case and the Chilcotin case. So you have a lot of frustration in that had Justice McEachran properly considered oral history evidence, there should have been a finding of fact that the Akisq and Wet'suwet'en had Aboriginal title. And so then you have the proposed pipelines in that area, and you have a lot of frustration in that you have a very good Supreme Court of Canada pronouncement involving the Akisq and Wet'suwet'en, but the Crown ignoring this decision and fostering the building of and development of pipelines through the lands of the Akisq and Wet'suwet'en. And up there you have, in their nation, they have a traditional governing system that manages their traditional territories. And you have, in the same area, you have First Nations that have authority under the Indian Act over their reserve lands, but you have the same, members who belong to the nation, but members who belong to the First Nation constituted under the Indian Act. You have a bit of a tension there internally, and so the issue here is, who has standing to represent the nation for Aboriginal title, and so the Crown agreed that the hereditary chiefs had standing. They had a mediation, and there's a resulting MOU, I believe, that was signed off, acknowledging the role of the hereditary chief system to be the governing body for the Crown to address. I don't know the status of what's happened there regarding the role of the hereditary chiefs and their addressing this issue of the Crown, but that's one of the, it's an outstanding issue. We were not involved in that case, but it's an ongoing issue for nations regarding who has standing to represent the members for the recognition of Aboriginal title.
Interesting. Is it hard to watch the disagreements? Like, you see videos online of police officers there almost ready to go, almost ready to fight with Indigenous people, and the mindset of the people there are, this is my grandparents' land, my great-grandparents' land, we have a connection to this and we don't want this to go through, and you can sympathize with them because it's so personal to them, and then it almost feels out of place for the police to be there in some regard, because it's not a violent situation unless things escalate further. It's people just standing their ground and trying to protect their land. And so when you see the police there, it almost gives those inklings of what we talked about before, of children being brought to school with police officers. Like, it's not the right place for them to be. How do you look at that situation?
Yes, with any protest, you have to, as a lawyer and also as a, First Nation person, you have to look at, is the context of what's happening. And so it's not, your own community, it's a different nation. But nonetheless, you have to examine, what's happening. And this is the ongoing impact of, colonization regarding, how do you deal with this on a community basis? And so I always say it's just through a lot of dialogue, a lot of discussion, have lots of meetings, have understanding, because certainly it's very difficult when you have a police presence in a community. And so as an advocate, it's always trying to have a process to have a way for people to be heard, to listen to concerns, and have a process to try to resolve the conflict. And so it's really up to the nation itself, the community, and the government to work together to try to find workable solutions. Interesting.
So I'm wondering, what are the best case scenarios? You've gotten to work with various First Nations communities. You've seen mining, you've seen fish businesses. When I think of growing communities that are setting a positive example, I personally think of Stahelis First Nation, Musqueam, Squayala, Shiacton. Those are within my general region, and I've obviously seen them develop and seen the resources they're able to provide to their community members. But for you, you've worked across BC, you understand kind of what's going on more at a national level. What communities stand out to you where it's like they've got something going on here that general people might not know about, but they're kicking butt?
Right. Usually it's based upon having a good community process, where you have sound policy, sound laws, sound process, active community engagement, and creating a good circle to listen to the community, have a good circle of good. It's a good, like, people who have the capacity, who have the knowledge, who want to work together as a team. So having very good teams in place, and so you might have different teams that form part of the greater circle, and so you're having the leadership supported by good teams, having the leadership work of the membership, having a full circle, fully inclusive, and just trying to get the best result, but recognizing it may take time to achieve that result. Nothing happens overnight. There may be conflict along the way, but trying to look at different possibilities, keeping an open mind. But you have to have a solid foundation, and the solid foundation is for us is providing the legal tools of having the best contract in place, policy in place, laws in place, reporting out information. And so we talk about FPIC between a nation and company and between the nation and government. The nation also has to have a FPIC standard with their members to ensure that members have information, have prior information, are fully involved. And so when you have the best management practices, so that you have the money is invested, and you have a return on investment, and having the ability to have membership benefit from any resulting benefit agreements. So you just have to look at the overall framework. And so some nations have been more pronounced and more out there. Some are more quieter. So you see different levels of success, and you can learn from one another. But what are the best practices? And so you look at the best practices of ensuring that you have lots of training, lots of capacity, and just sometimes it's just a lot of hard work and lots of meetings.
So I'm interested, what are some case studies? Are there some communities you look at and you go like, if people want to get started in this is sort of a general rubric. Look at, I don't know, I think the Dene, you've worked, like, which communities stand out to you where it's just like they're moving in the right direction, they're doing what they need to do? A
lot of it's based upon location, the access to resources, and the willingness of the Crown to negotiate. So I look at my wife's community, the Tahltan. They've been quite successful because they have had a lot of mines in their territory over many years. It provides very good jobs for their membership, and they're fully involved in all aspects of the economy in their territory. In my own area, when I look at the 15 bands in my own area, every band is a different level of development. But you also have to look at the impacts of colonization. So some communities have been more affected by residential school, and maybe they don't have the same access to resources. So I find that communities that are able to develop their reserve lands for leasing have done quite well. And so you look at the West Bank First Nation as one. They have their own self-government, their own lawmaking ability, and they've done quite well. And you look at Osoyoos is always put out as a model. But again, it's about location. They both those nations are located in the Okanagan, so they have very good locations for development. And then you have some nations that are in the Lower Mainland that have benefited from their reserve land development. So you have to look at and some nations have independent power projects in their backyard. So they have agreements for these power projects that provide ongoing revenue. And some have agreements of mining companies that provide revenue sharing of the mine tax. And so there's, throughout across Canada, there's many examples of nations that are doing very, very well. But yet many nations are still underdeveloped to this day. And they're underdeveloped for various reasons. And maybe it's because of lack of redress by Canada regarding historic wrongs. So you have many nations that have outstanding specific claims. And so Canada has ongoing liabilities for these historic specific claims that there's virtually thousands and tens of thousands of these claims across Canada. So they're unresolved to this day. These ongoing legacy projects of these ongoing mines, linear projects that have not benefited the Indigenous nations. How can we provide the opportunity for these nations to benefit from these projects to this day? And so, so it depends upon the nation to leverage their assets, their land assets, their territory assets, their resource assets, and also their human assets. And human assets, is really their members. Supporting their members to be, trained to have, full education. I mean, I can talk about education. It's just not about, the mainstream education. It's about having, cultural education and so on.
Interesting, because that is something we experienced in my community. Is we had a specific claim for Seabird Island Band. Originally, the area of Seabird was given as land for the 7 different communities, and so the 7 different communities within the area all proceeded with a specific claim to be paid out because people came to the federal government and said, hey, we'd like to be our own reserve. And the government said, sure, why not? Not really thinking about the fact that they were taking away land that was shared between various communities. One of the challenges we faced, though, was that we got a significant portion of money, but then we didn't have a well-articulated plan of what we were going to do with that money. So we ended up giving, I think, around $15,000 to each member and not having like a way of saying, hey, this might not be great for you in the long term. We might be able to build better resources, better services, buy back other land that interests us to kind of make sure that we act in the long-term 7 generations interest of our community.
Mm-hmm. Right. So for any resulting compensation package, you might have a large amount that's paid over. You might have ongoing payments. And this is what comes down to accountability and choices for the leadership and community. So the per capita payout is probably not the preferred approach for sustainable community development. Provides some short-term payments, which is great for the members. But looking at the long term, looking down at the future generations, you might be wise to use those funds to, buy back lands, build up your businesses, buy businesses, invest in equipment, and make other investments in the community. Maybe invest in more education opportunities, training programs, buildings, and provide for healing programs, cultural programming, language development, and so on. So looking at the community needs, and so it's really up to the community to have those priorities. But it comes down to having the community to be able to inform the process to how those monies are invested, expended, and accounted. So most nations are very, very good regarding involving the membership and having planning and investing the monies wisely. But there are some nations that are lacking to this day, where there's no accountability, no audits, so that's sort of an ongoing issue.
Yeah, that's one of my questions for you is I'm running for chief of my community right now, and I don't want to pretend I have all the answers. I don't pretend to know what it's like for them to live on reserve. So one of my hopes is to really start that community consultation process meaningfully, listen to every member, try and understand where they're at on and off reserve, and trying to develop a plan around what their experiences and what their hopes are. But I'm wondering, should I be looking to work with a law firm? Should I be putting that into the back of my mind now and working with a financial company to help make sure that when we do develop, we have a plan in place? And then this kind of dovetails into my questions about economic development corporations and where they come in.
Right. Yes, for community development, quite often you have a team. You might have a law firm. The lawyers might help negotiate. You might have your own negotiator. You might have your own planning firm. You might have your own architect, your own engineers, community planners. So you have a whole team, financial planners. So you have a whole team, and it really depends upon financing. Do you have the finances to build out a very good team? You might have a small team, but in the day is that you have to keep pace with the community. And so how do you engage the community, provide information? And it's like a looping process, regarding, listen to the issues, what are the plans, and to have those plans implemented with the support of your team. And so that's always the live issue. So I find that, working with, leadership, quite often it's an ongoing working relationship to try to get the best result. And it's also being patient. Things will take time. I call it the Canadian way because things just take time. And to, shop around. There's choices, and get references and so on. Because sometimes you just sort of fall into the same advisor. Sometimes it's good to maybe change it up, maybe, or use different professionals to assist, and also to build up membership by having membership involved in negotiations, part of the negotiation team. Always having I call it a circle, having a good circle. Yeah. And having that circle also involved with membership, having the full circle. So
interesting. So do you think that it's just a time thing where we just bring in good resources and things start to improve? Is it pretty consistent that things get a lot better with economic development? I don't know why, but I feel like there's some people I've spoken to that are almost skeptical of economic development.
Right. So really, it's having the leadership know how ECDev can occur for the community, within the community, like on the reserve, but also within the territory. Having an understanding regarding how leadership may have oversight of the controlled corporation. Having an understanding regarding the use of partnerships, joint ventures. And having an understanding regarding, if you're negotiating with a company, what are their interests? What's the interests of the Crown? What's the interests of the province? Because everybody has their own different interests. And learning regarding how negotiations happen over time. And so just having more information. So you may have, 5 people on leadership, and they may not have a business background, but over time through training and sharing, that they'll have appreciation regarding the benefit of having a corporation. And in fact, most communities have more than one corporation. They'll have multiple corporations for different businesses.
Do you think that government funding is at all dangerous? Just looking at my community, it reminds me, I don't know if you've ever seen the Fast and Furious movies, but there's one where there's this guy, I think it's in Mexico or Brazil, and he goes, we give them just enough to get by, but not enough to ever revolt or stand up or to fight. And that's how I feel in some regard, is that it's almost like we get so used to every year we get about this amount of money and then we have to allocate this amount of money, that the imagination that it could be double, triple, quadruple, whatever we're used to, starts to fade away from the minds of the members. And that's one of the things I think about in regards to economic development, is we need to kind of get off of government funding, stop waiting for it to arrive, and start having a sense of independence, a sense of sovereignty, a sense of we have our own bucket of money to pull from if an issue arises. We're not solely reliant on somebody checking a box in Ottawa or something like that.
Right. So in respect to government funding, so funding is always required for, as a governing body, you always need to have some form of transfer payment to provide the capacity to provide services to your membership, whether it's education, whether it's training, health, for welfare. So you need to have the capacity to provide these basic human rights. Housing is a basic human right. So you need to have funding for housing, for renovations. But at the same time, you want to make sure that the membership are able to have their own source of revenue from business opportunities, so that you can make the everybody's proud that saying that this is our business. We raised $1 million to this business, or maybe it's 10 million. This is our own financing, and that this financing built these community buildings, or created these jobs, these businesses. So it's regarding how to grow your own source of revenue over time, so that this is your business profits being reinvested in the community. And we've seen that for many nations, they've grown from having no own source revenue to having multiple millions of own source revenue that's reinvested back into the community. And so it's I'm quite happy to see when I see the financial statements that community has X million or XX million from these businesses that are reinvested. So I'm not involved in the financial aspect. We're just involved in helping negotiate the agreements. But it's great to see how communities invest back into the community.
Yeah, and then they have opportunities, it sounds like, to buy back land, to make sure that there's housing resources, that there's proper development, and that there's a certain quality of life for everyone. And then people really start to flourish. Because the thing that breaks my heart the most, and I'm sure you've seen this, is like, depending on your postal code, it kind of dictates whether or not you're likely to graduate high school, go to university, have a high quality career, have your health taken care of, like different things that it makes me sad to think that just because you live on this reserve, which is 3 blocks away from the municipality, you have a different quality of life that you have to go through. I just think that that's incredibly unfair.
Yes, I think through support, providing capacity. So I think that each nation's a bit different, but it's trying to provide those supports, especially to those who need those supports. And so you have some families that may need more support just because of their circumstances, maybe because of family breakdown, maybe have recovery from drug and alcohol. You just need to have those supports. And so having those supports turns over time into positive outcomes. And so I know that for myself, through my career, I've received supports from different other professionals, other community members who provide opportunity, who provide supports, who provide coaching, and so it's always trying to provide those supports to the community so that they have the ability to be their best.
What do you think the catalyst is for a community to go from struggling to strong economic development, long-term planning, community consultation? Do you think it's a charismatic leader who cares? Do you think that it's just over time getting tons of people kind of filling those roles on chief and council that understand what's been tried before, what's failed? How do communities take that major first step towards opening the doors for business?
Right. It's really having a good governance framework, policy, laws in place, training, and then also negotiating the best agreements. The best agreements with industry, with the Crown, and also ensuring that some land is perhaps available for business development in the community based upon business community choices. So just trying to leverage your land, leverage your resources, leverage your traditional territory into the best result. So it doesn't need to be like full cell development, but just trying to have having some small victories and build upon those small victories into bigger victories. When I say victories, like having good agreements.
Yeah, interesting. Do you think that when First Nations are sitting down, who do you think is the more challenging person to work with, industry or government?
It really depends upon the project and the openness and willingness of the partners. So some companies are very good. They know that they have to honor and implement the FPIC standard, but some companies try to get away with things cheaply. And so it's really about how companies have evolved over the years, and so it's really it's a whole mindset, and trying to make it a win-win. That it could be good for the community, it could be good for the company, so you get the best results. It's also having the government, and so the issue of government is that you're dealing with a bureaucracy that's very slow to change, and trying to show that the sky's not going to fall in, that it could be a win-win, that if you provide, a sharing of the wealth, that it's a win-win-win. And so the sharing of the wealth is, more sharing of the royalties, more sharing of decision-making, being fully included in any project.
What has your experience been like when people work with you? What is your philosophy? A First Nation calls you up, says, we need your help. What is your role in these negotiations and helping communities start to succeed?
It's to understand the priorities and plans of the nation, and they set the agenda, and they may want to partner up, they may want to develop, and it's trying to have a team to get the best result, whether it's the compensation, the financial payments, the terms of the agreement for opportunities. And so it's always trying to push the envelope. And when you push the envelope so much that you don't know whether you'll get it or not, but you may get more money, you may get more opportunities, you may get more preferential opportunities. You just keep on pushing the envelope, knowing that it's all they can do is say no, but you always try to achieve yes. So,
what would be your pitch be for somebody who's like, we're choosing between Aboriginal lawyers? Where is your differentiation between other Aboriginal lawyers?
I think it's trying to understand and respect the community, and be in step with the community, and provide the best results, so that we know that they have choices, and is always to honor the instructions, to ensure that they have the full range of options, and to work with them for the best solution, and ensuring that they have the best agreement possible, and to ensure that the resulting agreement stands the test of time. And the thing with negotiating impact benefit agreements is that you can never fully foresee what may happen in the future. So you always try to anticipate things that may happen, and sometimes you have to have a phased approach to an agreement.
Interesting. My big fear, if I am elected, is that industry or government is going to have a number, their maximum or whatever it is. They always come in, say, hypothetically, just throwing out numbers, they have $1,000 and they go, we'll give you $1,000 for this. My big fear is that behind the scenes, their max is like $100,000, $1 million. Is that a stress? Do you feel like there is good mechanisms in place to make sure that that's not going on?
Right. So usually in negotiations involving money, it's always sometimes informed by appraisal. If it involves land, it involves fisheries, having a fishery assessment. So you just have you work with different advisors to inform the financial envelopes. It's not guesswork. So you try to ensure that if you have assessments, evaluations, appraisal, that you always go beyond those professional reports, trying to get the best result. And so it's a principle of equitable compensation, is that it's not just based upon the report, it's based upon the losses to the community. And those losses may not be you can't calculate them on a calculator, but you try to provide a number that will honor the community for the impacts, and that will be embraced. And so it's not perfect, but you try to push and push and push, and get a fair result.
One fear that I have now, I just sat down, I don't know if you've heard of him, his name's Marvin Rossano, and he's a biologist. He was involved in the documentary Heart of the Fraser. The Heart of the Fraser is from Mission all the way up to Hope, and apparently 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 million fish swam through the Heart of the Fraser and spawned and developed. And when I sat down with him, he was like, we're at about 700,000, which is nowhere near the number that it was 10 years ago. And he has sincere concerns that all of the Fraser is going to be developed one day, that it's not going to be a river anymore. That recently, I think it was, I could be wrong on the organization, but Callison Farms bought some of the islands in between the Fraser, and that is likely going to be developed over time, and that they're going to develop dams on each side to start to build more, I'm not sure, agriculture probably. And when I asked him, like, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to get out of this? How are we going to make sure we don't lose those fish populations? He was like, nobody cares. Nobody's doing anything. He's like, I've presented dozens of times to thousands of people, to First Nations communities, to universities, to experts in government, to provincial, federal. And he's like, we may just not have fish really flowing through the Fraser anymore. That is the trajectory we seem to be on, and nobody's doing anything about it. The fear that comes in is we're fighting for Aboriginal rights and title. We're fighting for the right to have access to these fish. But my community held our salmon ceremony in August because we were waiting so long for fish to come. I'm interested in your thoughts on this. How do we look at this when it looks like some of the ecosystems that we care about are just disappearing? They're not going to offer any of the fruits that they once offered. We're going to hit a point where it's like, what are we fighting for if there's no fish in the Fraser for our fishing rights?
Right. So with respect to fishing, so I personally fished myself. It was a very good year this year, but the last 2 years were pretty lean, and so because the last 2 years the fisheries closed basically to the sockeye. So the last 2 years we caught springs. This year we caught sockeye, and so in respect to the fishery is that. The big issue here is that the fisheries managed by DFO, Fisheries and Oceans Canada. There is no true co-management for the fisheries. So although fishery is our people's food, we're not involved in the co-management of the fishery. That needs to change. And so how can Canada be more inclusive to manage the fishery? How do you reconcile the the commercial fisheries with the food fishery? And then you have the climate change, which is becoming more serious now. And so how do you deal with the water temperature increase and so on? So these are very dear issues to our nations regarding how do we address climate change while ensuring that our people have access to the fishery for food, social, ceremonial purposes, and so it needs to be greater involvement of our people. So you talk about resource development pressure. So our people should be involved in planning, dealing with development, to ensuring that the riparian areas are protected and for the fishery and so it just needs to probably have a different mindset because the fisheries are still managed like they were, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And so things have not evolved.
So that is one example. I think there's conservation officers now that are Indigenous. I read a short article about something going on in northern BC around Indigenous communities being given back the responsibility of sort of maintaining habitats and stuff. Do you know more about that?
I haven't seen. I know that when we were last summer, we were stopped by the Fisheries and Oceans after fishing, and they wanted to know. Actually, they stopped us on the river. I was fishing for spring, and also was packing out, and also got stopped again. And so I know that I believe some of them were Indigenous. They didn't actually identify being Indigenous, but it's great to having more Indigenous officers that work for Canada, but at the same time, we need to have more officers that we need to have our own nations who have their own officers who have officer power, and that's going to be the very big issue here, and how to have our own people manage the fishery, be the stewards of the fishery.
Yeah, I think there's so much to learn from Indigenous knowledge keepers, elders around keeping healthy environments, ecosystems. Like, I'm sure you follow John Burroughs, like some of his writing on how we look at Indigenous knowledge and apply it to how we maintain. I think the section I saw was him and butterflies, and his mother understanding that if butterflies don't visit this year, it means we've done something wrong, that we need to take better care of the environment. Does that interest you at all?
Yeah, I think it's about sustainable development, and regarding just being involved in management, knowing what's happening on the land, I know that for us, when there's a flower that blooms when the spring are returning, and so you have the connection of our way of life to the resources, and without fish, it'd be like it fully change our culture, way of life. Yeah. And so we need to ensure that we have the fishery for our next generations, and have the ability to have a greater say. I think poaching is a big issue, so we need to help ensure there's no poaching. When I say poaching, so there's some wasted fish down by Surrey that was just dumped, which is just wasted, and so we just need to deal with these issues that confront the fishery. At the same time, we need to have a redress for the impacts on our fishery from historic activities, namely the construction of the railway. So we know that when the CN Railway was built in 1913, 1914, that there's two major slides that impacted our fishery to this day. And so, although our people were affected by that historically, that impact still continues on to this day. So we know that in 1914, when our people had no access to fishery, they had to go to the lakes to get the fish, and so they had to travel some distance. And so right now there's no process to address the Hell's Gate legacy, the Hell's Gate slide.
Wow. As well, you are from a community, near a community that was detrimentally impacted by not only fires, but the atmospheric river. My understanding is mudslides. From that, I'm hearing that there's some positive development. Obviously, it's a tragedy, but making more fire-resistant homes. Can you speak at all to the development that's going on in Lytton right now?
Yes. So I've been involved behind the scenes. I've provided my legal work to my First Nation on a volunteer basis. It helped with the contracts for a lot of things that are happening, on the ground, for the temporary housing that was just put in place. There was 42 modulars installed. And so I helped behind the scenes on that work. Things are quite slow for my liking, I guess. And just, I guess, it's this process. You want to go fast because you have members living in motels, and so you try to provide your assistance, your help. But things have just been slow for whatever reason. And it's going to be an ongoing process. My wife's community, Telegraph Creek, was also affected by wildfire in the year 2018, and they also lost quite a few homes. So I know it's a multi-year process to have homes rebuilt and for the community to return, and so it just takes time. But nonetheless, there are some things that need to be probably addressed to address the ongoing impacts. And so, one is I think it's having we talk about having a circle, having a team the recovery team more of a bigger circle so that everybody knows what's happening. So I think you have a lot of teams working in silos between the province, the village of Lytton, the First Nations, the tribal council. You have different teams working by themselves, and there needs to be some sort of more unified action to work more as one. And so I work with we have a language society called Pay a Week, which means working as one and working based on that philosophy. So right now we're not working as one. So although we have a common goal, there needs to be a better process to try to break down the barriers to work as one big team, to have members return, because so although we have 42 modulars built, there's still a need for more housing and to build the infrastructure, because we lost a band hall, we lost the Rosie Sky building, which was a cultural building. We lost other community buildings. And then you have all the services that were lost, downtown Lytton, the post office, RCMP, the hospital, or health center. And so, so just it's going to be an ongoing work. The biggest issue, or one issue for the community, is that we have a tribal council that has received monies from the mine, and the tribal council is not using those funds, to my knowledge, for the recovery. They're using the funds for a different project, and everything is not being disclosed to the members. So it's not a very good situation where you have a lack of community input regarding the use of those funds from the mine for the and so it's an ongoing issue.
Interesting. Where, for you, does the court of public opinion come in? I've heard that things have taken far longer in Lytton than is fair, is just, after everything they've been through, not just one natural disaster, but two. When does that become appropriate? We see it with Wet'suwet'en. They post a lot. There are various people involved. Certain communities really leverage it. I don't know always to their benefit, whether or not the court of public opinion stays with you, or after a certain time you kind of lose the public support. How do you think about that? Because it does seem like First Nation communities have become fairly adept at using the court of public opinion to try and raise awareness of an issue, but it's a bullet in the chamber that you want to use carefully, thoughtfully, and so I'm just interested in your thoughts on that.
Right. So I think it's about the real issues, and I think it's dealing with capacity issues and trying to work with the various bureaucracies, trying to break down the barriers. And so with these events, the fire, the atmospheric river event, and just events linked to global warming, the fires that destroyed some more houses this past summer. So you have ongoing climate change issues, which are very serious. For me, as long as you have people who need support, you need to support those members. And so every day that a member's in a motel, you need to support those members. So some people may be calling it politics, but it's just regarding trying to take the best steps using best practices to support the community. And the difficulty here is that you probably need to have a review process to see what's happened, how can we make things better, improve the processes, because you're dealing with people's lives here.
Yeah, I just wonder if it weren't Lytton, if it were in Vancouver, it would be getting press coverage daily, even if people weren't seeking it out, and it would be at the front of people's minds. If it was in Victoria, the legislators would see that every day and think about it and have it at the front of their mind. My concern is that again, going back to postal codes, that because it isn't in everybody's face all the time, because it's a more rural community, they don't get the public attention, and so there's less scrutiny on going up to John Horgan or David Eby and being like, where are you at with Lytton First Nation? What are you doing for Lytton First? It's not constantly being bombarded in their face, so it maybe falls slowly over time from the priority list. Like we heard the same from farmers who were impacted by the atmospheric river and the events there, is that they just didn't feel prioritized the way that when things happened in the valley, it felt like things happened quite a bit quicker.
Yeah, I think it's difficult because of the area is not in the public eye as much anymore. But you have the ongoing impacts. It's affected my family. So I know what happened with my aunts and uncles and cousins and so on. And so you try to support. And so it's just going to take time. And I think that the issue is it's a bigger issue because it's dealing with climate change, which is here now. It's very apparent. And there's probably a broader risk for other communities down the road regarding, what are the standards for house building, the difficulties for getting, house insurance, and just being aware that you may need to be evacuated because of fire. And so it's just, so I think that it's in the attention of the public, but trying to have a ongoing process to address it, and it's going to require a lot of funding as well at the same time.
When did you decide you wanted to become an adjunct professor? When did you decide you wanted to start taking everything you've learned over the years and start sharing it with others?
I think that following law school and getting into practice, I had a teaching opportunity with it used to be called the Institute of Indigenous Government, the IIG. So I became a instructor teaching about self-government, Aboriginal rights, and so on. And then I was asked to teach a self-government class at the law school. And then one of the teachers who first taught the Indigenous Economic Development class, that teacher taught, I think, for one semester, and then after that, they asked me to teach it, and so I harnessed that opportunity, and that was back. I first started teaching at law school back in the year 2021, and so it's a honor to be able to teach to students and share your knowledge and to give back, and a lot of it's based upon my experience as a lawyer working for the communities, and so it's just it's sort of it's rewarding and takes a bit of time, but it's challenging because you got to be on top of everything every semester.
What do you hope students take away from the course? What tools do you hope that they remember? Obviously, the course covers a wide variety of topics, but if you can instill certain things, what stands out to you as the key kind of tools that will help them in their career?
So for the students to know that there's this potential for any nation, any community to develop their resources, develop their territory for the betterment of their community, and that there's different tools, there's different options, different choices. There's various legal means to get there, and there's options available, and it's also about trying to provide information regarding the possibilities.
You literally wrote the book on First Nations economic development. I'm wondering if you could tell us how your book came about and what the process was to put this together.
So it's a bit of a process in that over the years, Cynthia and myself have presented to different conferences, gatherings over the years, and because I've taught on the matter for years as well, every year I was trying to pull together materials for the class, and I thought it'd be useful to have one book to for the students so that they can access the information in one place. And so just basically it's, represents insight into our practice. It didn't include all of our trade secrets. So so I had my associates help out as well. And so it's been updated this year. So we actually have a second volume coming out in January. And just to provide, basic information to law students. And I know that from feedback from law students, they've been very pleased with the book. Some say that they use it all the time in their work. And I know that many of my past students have went on to become lawyers. And I know that the class has helped inform them in their legal profession. And so that's encouraging. And for me, it's just about if they can, gain this information, this insight into how to develop First Nations and Métis communities, then it'll help the greater good. And so it's just really a overview regarding how to provide a framework to develop a community nation based upon their Aboriginal rights and title, based upon their reserve lands, based upon the resources in their area, and dealing with the implementation of UNDRIP, implementation of FPIC, and how to negotiate impact benefit agreements, and how to implement IBAs, dealing with corporate structuring, tax issues, also dealing with treaty rights, and doing certain case studies involving gaming and casinos and successful First Nations.
Interesting.
And Métis groups.
Can you share kind of the rubric of the book, how the chapters go? How did that kind of come about? Did they come to you and say, hey, we want you to do a book? Did you come to them and say, hey, I've got a book idea?
So I approached LexisNexis with the concept back, I think, around 2016, and they said yes. They were fully supportive. And so it is a couple-month exercise to roll everything into the chapters. I leaned on my associates as well and my assistants, and we pulled it together, and it happened real quick. It's basically, based upon my classes are based upon, PowerPoint presentations. So it's rolling in the presentations into the chapter format based upon case law, legislation, policy, best practices, experiences of working with different First Nations and Métis groups across Canada, and provides a glimmer into the potential.
Interesting. What do you hope people take away from what you've experienced over your years of service working with First Nations communities, with your deep understanding of the development of various communities? What do you hope listeners might be able to take away from this?
That there's a potential to utilize the assets and the will of the community to advance their interests, to really put forward the best footing for recognition of their rights, for the accommodation of their rights, to have their rights honored through successive agreements with the Crown, with industry, and to provide opportunity for membership. And the opportunity might be, training, education, jobs, contracting, and so it's regarding how to harness possible benefits through legal instruments, legal tools.
Darwin, this has been an absolute pleasure. I think what you're doing behind the scenes, the impact you have with your book, being able to take a course with you, it completely changed my philosophy, my outlook on the best way to support communities in their development, in addressing, again, some of those issues that so many people know about. This seems like a tangible way forward for so many people. So I highly recommend people go grab the book. If you're Indigenous, it is a fantastic read. I found it so accessible. The language wasn't intimidating, and it gives really tangible, logical ways forward for a community to take those steps to get their members out of those circumstances, to help make sure they have all the resources they need to succeed, and so they have the right philosophy, the right ethos to kind of start to make those steps possible.
Thank you.
I really hope that we are able to do this again in the future, because I think there's so much people can learn from you. Do you have a way people can connect with you if they have more questions, if they want to connect further?
We do have a firm website, chlaw.ca, and I'm sort of more quiet off of social media. So I do have a Facebook account, but I'm not too active. I don't have a Twitter. I don't have Instagram. So I'm sort of, I won't say off the grid, but I try to keep on a down low, just because we do a lot of work for different nations. We try to keep all of the political spotlight. Yeah, so if, I'll just say that if you want to connect with me, just, you'll find me. So we'll cross paths at some point.
Sounds good. Yes. I think if they want to connect with you, they can probably go through your website and get your email address and information like that. Thank you so much for being willing to come on. This was an absolute pleasure.
Okay. Gukshamu, how much?